Hello everyone, my name is Julianna Zinchenko and welcome back to my YouTube channel. Today I will be showing you how to sew a cowl neck halter top. It is the top I am wearing right now. It gives like business in the front and party in the back. I also love this top because it feels very sophisticated. I feel very womanly in it and very sexy and mature at the same time. I also have a downloadable sewing pattern to go along with it to make it extra easy on you guys. You can get that in my Etsy shop. I will have that linked below. With a downloadable sewing pattern, you can print right at home, no waiting for shipping, which is really nice. All right, without further ado, let's get into the tutorial. All right, before we get started, here is a list of everything that I use in this video. I will also have links below so you guys can get exactly what I'm using. Okay, first things first, I want to go over a few things before we start sewing. So the pattern comes with different sizes, and there's two ways you can print it out, and that is at home using your home printer, or that is using a service like FedEx or a website that will print it out and send it to your home. I highly recommend FedEx. That is what I use to print out all of my patterns. You will see these two squares on your pattern. The bigger one is 2 by 2 inches and the smaller one is 2 by 2 centimeters. And it is to make sure that your pattern is scaled correctly. As you can see, I'm measuring the square here and it is perfectly 2 by 2 inches, so we're all set. If you choose to print your pattern out at home, what I recommend is printing out the first page of the file and measuring these squares to make sure that your pattern will be scaled correctly, and then printing out the rest of your pattern. If you choose to print your pattern out at home, you will need to tape the pieces together. Each of the pattern pieces are numbered. As you can see here, the front piece is number 1. Then you will see these half hearts that have a letter in them. So what you're going to do is you're going to find all the pieces with the same number, and then you're going to match up the hearts with the same letter. And then you're going to tape the pieces together. Do not overlap the pieces. Just simply put them next to each other like I'm doing here, and then tape them together. This is what it should look like when you are all finished. Also, a great way to store your patterns is to punch a hole in them and then hang them up using a pattern hanger. I will have the hanger and the hole punch that I use below. You're probably wondering, what type of fabric do I buy for the cowl neck top? The most important thing with a cowl neck top is you want a good drape. As you can see here, I'm moving my fabric around and you can see how nicely it moves. So really think of movement when you're picking out your fabric for this top. A lot of times picking out fabric has a lot to do with intuition. So feeling it, looking at its drape, it's like you'll know when you know. But if you are not able to go to a fabric store in person, I will have links below to fabrics that I would buy for this top. Next, you're going to want to identify the selvage edge on your fabric, and that is just the finished edge. On a lot of woven fabrics, it's pretty easy to make out where the selvage edge is. Also, when you look closely, you'll see that the selvage edge has a lot of holes poked in it. The reason why it's important to know where the selvage edge is so that we know which direction to place our pattern pieces. On my pattern pieces, you will see there is a double arrow indicating the warp grain line, and you want this double arrow to be parallel to your selvage edge. Okay, so I'm just going to place my pattern along the folded edge there and pin my pattern to my fabric to keep it in place while I'm cutting it. You'll notice on the pattern these triangles along the edge, and these are called notches. These serve as guidelines for when you're sewing, and how you cut with notches is when you approach the notch, what you want to do is you just want to mirror it. So you're just going to cut in the opposite way. Now, a lot of the times a cowl neck top is cut on the bias, but for this particular design, I just don't like cutting on the bias. I think it works much better when you cut parallel to the selvage edge. I'm going to do the same thing with the lining piece. I'm going to identify the selvage edge and then make sure that it's parallel to that arrowed line on my pattern, and then I'm going to put the pattern on the fold.
Now with the waist tie, you will see that there is no arrowed line on it. When a pattern piece doesn't have that double arrowed line, that means it does not matter the direction you place the pattern piece. So you can either put it perpendicular or parallel to the selvage edge, it does not matter. Now, I do want to point out though that you can save fabric depending on which way you place your pattern piece. When you go to a fabric store, they cut fabric lengthwise. So if I'm going to place my waist ties like the image on top, I could save more fabric because I won't need to get as much. Now, if I decide to place them like in the image below, I'm going to need to buy more fabric. With that being said, if you're going to place your pattern pieces like the top image, you need to make sure that you have a fabric that is wide enough. If you don't, then you have no other option than to place them like in the image on the bottom. My fabric is wide enough, so I'm going to place my waist ties perpendicular to the selvage edge. And you're going to be cutting 2 of these, so I like to just fold my fabric so I can cut 2 at one time. Alright, we're finished with cutting, so now we can start the fun part. What you're going to want to do is fold your waist ties in half, right sides together, and then we're going to sew along the raw edge using a 1/2 inch seam allowance. For my beginners, don't forget to backstitch at the beginning and end of your seam. Also, something I like to do is draw the corners with a fabric marker. This makes sewing the corners much easier. For extra guidance while you sew, you can draw the seam allowance line along the entire raw edge. Also, for my girly girls who usually have long nails, it really helps to use your nails to move fabric around. So I just wanted to point that out. I do use my nails a lot to work with fabric. Okay, next I'm going to find a line on my throat plate and use it as a guide. So I'm just going to line the raw edge of my fabric to that line. And then I'm going to position my needle to line up with the seam allowance line, which in this case is 1/2 inch. I'm even dropping my needle into the fabric just a little bit to see where it's going to end up. And it's hitting my line, so we're all good and ready to start sewing. And then of course I recommend matching your thread color to your fabric, but for the sake of this video so you guys can see, I'm using a contrasting thread. So now we're nearing the corner, and what you're going to do is sew up to that point of the corner. You want to make sure that your needle is lowered into the fabric, don't lift it up. Lift up your presser foot so that we're able to move the fabric around. Swing your fabric around and reposition it. I'm just realigning it with the same line that I chose on my throat plate. And then you're going to lower your presser foot and continue sewing. When you're done sewing, clip off all the loose threads. And as you can see here, we have a nice sharp corner. For step 2, we're going to cut our seam allowance in half using pinking shears. For the corners, you want to get a little bit closer because when we turn these waist ties out, we want the corners to be really sharp, and this reduces bulk. With that being said, make sure you don't cut too close to the corner. I probably got a little too close here, but yeah, you just want to get a little bit closer to the corners. For step 3, you're just going to put your arm through the waist tie until you reach that pointed end there. And as you can see, I have my finger on the inside poking out that point there, and then I'm just going to use my finger on the outside to push it through, and then use my finger on the inside to grab it, and then pull it out until your waist tie is right side out. And then I'm going to use a point turner to make the corners nice and sharp. And make sure you use the point turner gently and slowly. I've poked a hole through my seam using this thing before, so just be careful. For step 4, we're going to iron down the edges of our waist ties. And what I do is I use my fingers to shimmy the fabric until I get right up to that seam there. As you can see, you can kind of even see the threads, and then iron it down. As you can see here, the iron is such a game changer. It is so vital to use an iron while sewing, especially using steam. And then if you've watched my videos, you know that I always recommend using a tailor's clapper when you iron down your pieces because it just makes it extra flat, but it is optional. All right, this is what they should look like when you're all finished, nice and flat, and the corners are nice and sharp. All right, now we're going to move on to our front piece and the lining. Now when you unfold the front piece, you'll see that there is a short end and a long end, and then you're going to place your lining along that short end and place them right sides together and sew using a 1/2 inch seam allowance. Now before I start sewing, I'm just going to draw the seam allowance line to help me sew a straight line. Even though I drew the seam allowance line, I'm still going to use the lines on the throat plate to help guide me. This is what it should look like when you're all finished, and don't forget to clip all your loose threads. Moving on to step 6, you're just going to open up that seam and iron it down. And for our next step, you're going to lay your top with the right side facing up, and then you're just going to fold it in half with the right sides together. And then you want to pin along the curved edge on both sides, but you want to leave the bottom edge open. And this is the part where your notches will also help you out. They should all be aligned. All right, now for step 8, we're going to go back to our waist ties and we are going to sew a basting stitch 1/4 inch from the raw edge. Now for my beginners, you're probably like, what is a basting stitch? A basting stitch is just a straight stitch, but with a really long stitch length. So as you can see here, I'm increasing my stitch length on my sewing machine to the highest number it will go, which is 5.0 millimeters. And I'm also going to start sewing about 1/8 of an inch in. Because another thing about a basting stitch is you do not backstitch. So you just start sewing because we need those threads to be able to move because we're gonna end up pulling the threads to gather the fabric. So make sure you don't backstitch at the beginning and end of your stitch. You're just gonna sew a straight stitch and be done. And I like to pull out a lot of thread to get a good length so I'm able to pull it. This is what it should look like when you're finished. You have 2 loose threads hanging from both ends. Now moving on to step 9, you're just going to grab 1 thread from either side, it doesn't matter which side, and you're just going to pull and slide the fabric along that thread until you get a good gathered edge. And you can also pull from the other end to help gather as well. And you're probably wondering, how do I know when to stop gathering? You want to keep gathering the fabric until it's the same length as the space between the notches. As you can see here, mine fits in between the notches, so I am all good and ready to go. All right, now we're going to sandwich the waist ties in between the sides here. And I like putting the end of the tie that's longer at the top notch, but it doesn't really matter. That's just my personal preference. So you're going to need to unpin at the area between the notches, and then slide your waist tie in from the bottom and repin with your waist tie sandwiched between the two layers. Okay, so when you're done pinning both waist ties, you're just going to stuff both of them inside and then pin along the bottom edge. Alright, moving on to step 12, you're going to sew along the raw edge where I've indicated, and don't forget to backstitch at the beginning and end, of course, but also we're going to backstitch at the notches because we're going to be tugging on our waist ties a lot, and these areas are going to experience a lot of stress, so we just want to make sure they're extra secure. And just like I did with the waist ties, I'm going to draw the seam allowance at the corner, so it makes it easier for me to sew the corner. And since I didn't draw a seam allowance line this time along the raw edge, I'm going to measure a 1/2 inch from a line that I just chose on the throat plate, and then I'm going to position my needle until it's a 1/2 inch away from that line. And then again, I'm going to start sewing about 1/8 inch from the edge, because sometimes if you start right at the beginning, your fabric can get swallowed into the hole underneath your presser foot. Also, an underrated tip while sewing is to make sure that your garment is fully on your sewing table. If you let it hang off, it can pull and stretch your fabric and it can mess up your seams. And as you can see here, when I get to that notch, I'm just backstitching. And I backstitch a couple times actually. I just like it to be extra secure. And once you're done, you want to clip your loose threads. You might even have the loose threads from the basting stitch on our waist ties still hanging out. And just like we did with the waist ties, we're going to cut our seam allowance in half using pinking shears, and then also just get a tiny bit closer to the corners to reduce bulk in that area. Alright, and then when you're finished, you're going to want to take your seam ripper and seam rip a 2 to 4 inch hole in the center of that lining seam. Using the hole we just created, you're going to want to take one end and slide it over to the other end. This is going to be the part that wraps around your neck in the back. So what I'm going to do is just slide my hand through that hole and grab one end of that section there. And then I'm going to use my other hand to just fold a little bit of that fabric on the inside there so I'm able to grab it with my other hand. And then I'm just going to shimmy it over to the other side. And then once you reach the other side, the right sides should be together. And what you're going to want to make sure that you do is align the seam there. As you can see here, my seam lines are a little bit off. I'm just going to move it just a touch. And there we go. That is perfect. This is how yours should look. And then I'm just going to shimmy it back in so that the raw edges are all aligned. And then I'm going to pin all 4 layers of fabric together. And then you're just going to sew a basting stitch 1/4 inch from the edge. And just like we did with the waist ties, you're just going to pull one thread from either end and slide the fabric along that thread. And I actually use both sides. As you can see, I'm pulling from both sides to gather the fabric. And the goal is to get it to be 1 inch wide. If you can't get it 1 inch wide with just gathering it, that's totally fine, because we're also going to end up gathering it while we sew, which I will show you how I do that in a minute. And then I'm just going to tie 2 knots on both ends to keep the gathering in place while I sew it. Next, you're going to set your machine back to a regular stitch length and sew 1/2 inch from that raw edge. And even if my gathering is at 1 inch, I still like to gather while I sew. And how I do that is I lower my needle into the fabric, and then I lift my presser foot up, and then just push some of the fabric underneath the presser foot, lower the presser foot, and then I keep pushing the fabric as I sew. This should help create some extra gathering for you. And be careful, watch your fingers during this part. And as you can see here, it is still 1 inch long, and I am very happy with that. Now just clip your loose threads and cut the seam allowance in half using pinking shears. Y'all know the drill at this point. Alright, now we're so close to being done. What you're going to do is use the hole in the lining seam to turn our top right side out. Now this is the back seam that we just sewed. This is what it should look like from the outside. Alright, and then you're going to use that hole again to go in with a point turner to make the corners nice and sharp. Alright, now we just have to close up this hole in our lining seam, and you can do this 2 ways. You can do it either by hand or using the sewing machine. Let's start with the first option, which is using our sewing machine. So what you're going to do is simply press the edges of the opening together so they align neatly, and then you're going to pin along that edge. And I like to pin close to the edge because that is where we're going to be sewing. And then you're just going to sew along that edge there. And then you're going to want to sew a little bit before the hole opening, and at the end a little bit after the hole opening. And what I'm going to do is align my fabric to the edge of the presser foot on the inside there to just use as a guide and help me sew a straight line. And then I'm just going to position my needle to be as close as I can get to the edge. You want to get close to the edge, but of course not close enough to where your needle doesn't catch the fabric. Alright, that is it for the first option. This is what it should look like when you're all finished. And don't forget to clip your loose threads. Moving on to our second option, which is hand stitching the hole closed. This one will just give you a flatter seam. So what you want to do is you want to gently open up the seam where the hole is. Take your needle and put it under the fold on either side and poke it right into the crease, that folded line on the edge of the fabric. Try to start just before the hole so your stitch looks like it was always part of the seam. Next, take your needle over to the other side of the hole, the side that you didn't just stitch, and poke the needle right into the crease on that side and pull it through. You want to grab just a little bit of fabric, and then you're going to go over to the other side and do the same thing, and then keep repeating this. So you're going to keep switching sides, grabbing a little bit of that crease line. Now this stitch is called a ladder stitch. It's also known as a blind stitch or an invisible stitch. And the reason we call it a ladder stitch is because when you pull your seam apart, the stitches will be parallel to each other, resembling a ladder. All right, when you reach the end, you're just going to take your needle and poke it under right in the middle of the seam, and then you're going to tie a knot on the top. See, we have our knot right in the middle there. Then you're going to poke it back in the middle of the seam and a little bit through the lining there so that we hide the rest of the thread inside of the lining. And pull the thread all the way through and then cut with your clippers. All right, that is it. We are all finished. Like I said before, this one is really nice because your seam is nice and flat. And for step 24, you're just going to iron down the seam no matter which option you ended up doing. You can barely tell there was ever a hole there. All right, we are all finished. The last thing we have to do is iron down the edges of the top. Ugh, I cannot get over how nice it looks when you iron it. All right, this is what it should look like when you are all finished. Let's see how it looks like on.
All right, that is it for the cowl neck halter top. I really hope you guys enjoyed this tutorial and enjoy the sewing pattern.
And also, I recommend using fashion tape for the chest area so that your boobies do not escape.
If you make this top, please tag me in it. I would die to see your guys' creations. And please do not hesitate to ask any questions you have in the comments below. I read all of my comments and I answer as quickly as I can. Don't forget to subscribe and hit that bell button to know when I have new sewing tutorials up. I will see you in my next video. Mwah.